When a man ignores you, the first impulse is to question yourself. What did you do wrong? Why did he pull away? Why is he silent when you've been present, loyal, and emotionally available? These questions don't arise from weakness. They arise from pain, confusion, and the deeply human desire to understand rejection. But the truth, as Louise would say, is that people treat others as a reflection of their inner state. His silence is not a mirror of your inadequacy. It's a projection of his own unhealed wounds. Men who disappear emotionally, without explanation, often aren't running from you. They're running from what your presence awakens in them. Your love, your vulnerability, and your consistency may remind him of everything he doesn't know how to give or never received. It's not that you are too much. It's that he has not yet learned how to hold what is real. And rather than admitting his emotional limits, he chooses silence, distance, or absence. These are not acts of power. These are symptoms of emotional avoidance. Louise Hay spoke often about the ways in which people project their inner turmoil outward. A man who shuts down communication may not even understand why he's doing it. But underneath there is often fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being seen. Fear of intimacy. Because intimacy demands that we show who we really are, without the roles, without the ego, without the illusion of control. And many men, conditioned by years of emotional suppression, don't know how to meet that level of honesty. What happens in relationships like this is subtle but deeply damaging. You start interpreting his silence as a verdict against your worth. You begin adjusting your behavior, trying to be more agreeable, less emotional, more distant yourself, hoping that he will come closer if you stop needing anything. This internal shift, this attempt to become invisible to avoid abandonment, starts eroding your self-respect. You shrink emotionally, but the distance doesn't close, because silence isn't solved by self-erasure, and love doesn't grow in the soil of insecurity. There's a painful irony in being ignored by someone you care about. You want to reach out, but every time you do, the silence grows louder. You want to fix it, but you can't fix what you didn't break. And this is where the most important truth begins to take shape. The way someone chooses to communicate or not communicate says everything about where they are in their own journey and very little about your value. This is not about blaming him. It's about not blaming yourself. A man who disappears when emotions become real is showing you his emotional bandwidth. And this is crucial to understand, because we are taught to romanticize silence. We are taught that if he pulls away, we should chase. If he ignores, we should prove ourselves. If he disconnects, we should try harder. But the foundation of true connection isn't built on trying harder for someone who's not trying at all. It's built on reciprocity, on presence, on mutual emotional responsibility. A man who cannot face his own discomfort will avoid yours. A man who never learned to express his needs will resent yours. And a man who fears vulnerability will label your openness as pressure. So when he chooses silence, don't fill in the blanks with self-doubt. Observe what the silence reveals. It doesn't say, "You're unlovable." It says, "I don't know how to love." This is the weakness that often hides behind the mask of distance. It's not indifference. It's not strength. It's emotional immaturity. A man who cannot face emotional tension will sabotage the very intimacy he says he wants. He might blame timing. He might say he's confused. But behind the excuses is a deeper truth. He's terrified of confronting the parts of himself that your love gently exposes. And instead of owning that, he hides. What many women don't realize is that this dynamic slowly teaches you to mistrust your instincts. You start believing that love must be hard, that maybe you expect too much, that your needs are the problem. But love that requires silence to survive is not love. It's survival. And you were not born to survive someone's avoidance. You were born to grow through mutual presence. When someone ignores you, it's not a cue to perform. It's an invitation to reflect. To ask yourself, why am I tolerating emotional absence? Why does his silence speak louder than my own boundaries? Why am I still hoping for words from someone who only offers silence? The man who ignores you is not in power. He is in fear. He is not leading the dynamic. He's escaping it. And the moment you begin to see that is the moment you take your power back, not by chasing, not by confronting, but by stepping out of the emotional trap and remembering who you are when no one else is watching. When silence becomes a pattern, it's no longer a mystery, it's a message. And that message has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with his wounds. The question is no longer, why is he doing this? But why am I still accepting it? Because the moment you stop internalizing his silence as your fault, you begin returning to yourself, not with bitterness, but with clarity. And from that clarity, something deeper begins to unfold. When a man ignores you, the silence you hear is not just absence, it's reflection. It's a mirror of what he can't yet face in himself, projected onto your presence. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in emotional relationships. We're taught to analyze what we did, where we failed, what words triggered the retreat. But the deeper truth often hides not in what you said or did, but in what your energy, your vulnerability, and your emotional clarity awaken in him. Many women carry a presence that is emotionally alive. That presence doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. But it is deeply perceptive. It sees through masks. It feels the shift when someone pulls away. And it doesn't settle for connection. That's just convenient. When you show up with that kind of presence, it disrupts anyone who's been functioning in emotional survival mode. It shines a light where he has only ever lived in shadow. And for many men, this is not empowering. It's terrifying. His avoidance is not random. It's a coping strategy, not just with you, but with life, with confrontation, with any form of intimacy that requires vulnerability. That's why Louise Hay always emphasized healing from the inside out, because people don't avoid you. They avoid the parts of themselves they don't want to be seen. You might express your needs, your emotions, your longings with sincerity, but if he's been conditioned to see emotional expression as weakness, he won't receive your openness as truth. He'll receive it as threat. This is the mirror that causes the most confusion when you offer love and receive distance in return. But the distance isn't about your love being too much. It's about your love being too real for someone who hasn't yet met themselves at that level of honesty. He may be attracted to you, but terrified by what that attraction evokes. And so he doesn't engage. He withdraws. He blames the timing. He claims confusion. But deep down, your presence brought something to the surface that he's spent years keeping buried. You might ask yourself, why does my softness trigger his coldness? Why does my clarity make him unsure? Why does my presence push him to retreat? These aren't signs of incompatibility. These are signs of inner conflict. His, not yours. And in that conflict, you become the scapegoat for everything he's not. Ready to feel. Your desire to understand him is human, but his silence is not a riddle you were meant to solve. It's an emotional wall he built long before you arrived. And it's a wall he must choose to dismantle, not because you waited long enough, but because he finally became willing. The tragedy of these dynamics is how often women blame themselves for what men haven't healed. How often you twist yourself, trying to become more easygoing, more chill, more less. But in doing so, you silence your own emotional truth just to maintain his comfort. And in that silence, you slowly disappear from yourself. The truth is, when someone ignores you, you're not just being excluded from their life. You're being invited to see how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice to be seen. And often what you're really fighting for is not the man. It's the feeling of not being rejected. But rejection from someone emotionally unavailable is not about who you are. It's about who he is not ready to become. Louise Hay taught that our relationships are always mirrors, not always of our flaws, but of our lessons. And this is one of the most brutal. Sometimes your presence alone is the test. You don't have to do anything wrong to trigger avoidance. You just have to be emotionally clear in a world full of people who are emotionally confused. And that clarity, your emotional strength, will threaten anyone who hasn't yet cultivated their own. So, what does his avoidance reveal? That he still lives behind an emotional mask, that he's not yet capable of facing connection without fear, that when confronted with love, he runs, not because you're unworthy, but because he still hasn't made peace with his own worth. And unless he begins to heal, anyone who gets too close will feel like danger, not safety. This isn't a call to diagnose him. It's a call to protect yourself from taking responsibility for someone else's growth. The moment you realize that his silence, his confusion, and his emotional absence are not yours to fix, you return to your own center. You stop chasing clarity from someone who doesn't even have it within himself. And here lies the mirror's deeper truth. When someone avoids you, they reveal how afraid they are of being seen. And in that reflection, you are given a choice. Not to fix, not to chase, not to prove, but to protect the emotional safety you've spent a lifetime learning to hold. What he can't face in you, he won't admit. But that doesn't make your presence a problem. It makes your presence powerful. And the sooner you recognize that, the sooner you stop standing in places where your truth is too much for someone else's denial. What he avoids in you is what he avoids in himself. And that has never been yours to carry. When a man ignores you and you start interpreting his silence as a form of control, superiority, or even mystery, there's something deeper happening behind the surface. Emotional inaccessibility is often misread as emotional mastery. But the truth is, what looks like strength is sometimes just unprocessed pain, and what feels like detachment is sometimes just fear dressed in pride. Society has trained men to equate distance with power. The less you feel, the more you're respected. The less you show, the more you're in control. And so, when a man retreats emotionally, he's not necessarily operating from confidence. He's operating from habit. He's avoiding intimacy, not because he's above it, but because he doesn't know how to exist within it. And when your emotional presence brings that truth to the surface, he either runs or shuts down. Louise Hay often spoke about how our behaviors are rooted in beliefs formed in childhood. If a man grew up in an environment where emotional expression was punished, neglected, or mocked, he learns early that to survive, he must shut down his heart. He learns that vulnerability equals danger, that openness invites harm, that feelings are liabilities, not strengths. So by the time he enters adult relationships, his default is not openness, it's withdrawal. And here is where the scar begins to masquerade as strength. He walks through life disconnected from his own emotional world. He engages with others from a place of calculation, not connection. And when he meets someone, like you, who doesn't operate on that frequency, who brings out honesty, softness, emotional integrity, he panics. Not visibly, not in a way you might immediately notice, but beneath his composed surface, a storm brews, because your presence triggers what he's worked his entire life to suppress. This is where many women fall into self-doubt. You start believing that your emotions are too much, that your depth is overwhelming, that your needs are unreasonable. But none of that is true. The reality is that you've simply become a mirror to someone who cannot handle the reflection. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because he's still trying to pretend there's nothing wrong within himself. You see, emotional inaccessibility is not calmness. It's chaos hidden behind control. It's the inability to process closeness without feeling threatened. It's a defense mechanism that pretends to be composure. And when someone is emotionally unavailable, they will always twist the narrative to protect themselves from their own discomfort. That's when they start to label your honesty as drama, your clarity as intensity, your openness as neediness. And here's the hardest truth. You cannot love someone into availability. You cannot soften your truth enough to make someone else emotionally ready. You can sit in silence beside them. You can wait. You can try to become less of yourself to fit their comfort zone. But in doing so, You betray your own emotional maturity. You shrink where you should expand. You apologize for feeling deeply in a world that desperately needs depth. What Louise Hay taught so clearly is that healing begins when we stop internalizing the rejection of others as a reflection of our worth. That includes when a man ignores you. His emotional absence is not proof that you're unworthy. It's proof that he's unready. And it's not your responsibility to carry his unreadiness like a secret you're supposed to decode. The wound he's hiding has nothing to do with you. But your presence touches it. Not because you're aggressive, not because you push too hard, but because you exist with emotional awareness. You speak with truth. You love with consciousness. And that level of presence can feel like exposure to someone who has spent his life hiding from himself. And this is the turning point for you. Understanding that emotional inaccessibility is not something to envy, chase, or decode. It's a sign of internal fragmentation. It's the result of emotional suppression that has calcified over time. And when someone's scar tissue is mistaken for emotional strength, entire relationships are built on illusions. You are not meant to spend your energy trying to convince someone that love is safe. You are not required to stand in silence, waiting for a scarred heart to speak. What he calls strength might just be survival. And what you're calling rejection might just be his inability to feel anything at all without shutting down. So the next time a man pulls away and hides behind silence, remind yourself, this is not proof of his power. It's a reflection of his pain. And while compassion can understand that pain, it should never cost you your own peace. What you perceive as coldness may be unresolved chaos. What you take as rejection may be his inability to sit with the version of you that doesn't need to be rescued, but simply wants to be met. And if he cannot meet you, that is his lesson to learn, not yours to carry. There's something subtle but deeply intentional behind the silence of a man who ignores you. It's not always just disinterest or emotional immaturity. Often it's about control. A silent man isn't always passive. Sometimes, silence is the loudest way to rewrite the narrative without saying a word. And when a woman begins to feel confused, unsure, destabilized by that silence, the power shifts. Men who ignore tend to rely on ambiguity. By not expressing what they feel, want, or intend, they force the other person to fill in the blanks. That uncertainty doesn't just create distance, it creates obsession. Because now you're thinking more about him than ever. You're replaying every conversation. You're interpreting small gestures as big signals. You're questioning your intuition. And in that psychological space, he gains ground. Not through presence, but through absence. This isn't always a conscious manipulation. Many men don't have the emotional tools to communicate, so silence becomes their default strategy. But the effect is the same. You begin to internalize his absence as a reflection of your value. And as Louise Hay often reminded us, anything we internalize without awareness becomes our reality. So you start showing up harder. You become more available. You reach out more. You try to be easier to love, and he says nothing. What's happening here is an emotional power imbalance. He creates confusion, and you respond with clarity. He withdraws, and you lean in. He destabilizes, and you compensate. Not because you're weak or desperate, but because your emotional intelligence pushes you toward connection, while his lack of awareness pulls him deeper into avoidance. The more emotionally present you are, the more he disappears. And it's not a coincidence. It's a dynamic. When a man ignores you, he is creating a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled by your thoughts, your emotions, your projections. Silence is never neutral. It becomes a canvas onto which you paint your deepest insecurities and hopes. And he watches, even from afar, how you respond. Whether consciously or not, he learns that he doesn't need to explain himself because your own mind will do it for him. And here's where the trap becomes more dangerous. You start adjusting yourself to fit the silence. You suppress your needs because you don't want to scare him away. You minimize your emotions because you think being too much is the reason he's distant. You shrink, subtly and consistently, until the version of you that's present in the relationship is barely a shadow of who you truly are. This is what Louise Hay would call a self-abandonment wound. A part of you believes that if you just become smaller, quieter, easier, more agreeable, then maybe he'll return. Maybe he'll notice. Maybe he'll finally speak. But what you're really doing is reinforcing a relationship where your voice doesn't matter, your needs are negotiable, and your presence is conditional on his approval. Let's be clear. When someone values you, they do not create confusion as a strategy. They do not weaponize silence. They do not let you question your self-worth in the echo of their absence. A man who ignores you isn't just pulling away. He's subtly suggesting that your presence is optional. And if you believe that long enough, you start treating yourself as optional too. Control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sophisticated, dressed in stillness. But the result is the same. It keeps you emotionally off balance. And when you're off balance, you lose access to your inner truth. You start reacting instead of responding. You start performing instead of expressing. And this is exactly how the power dynamic tilts in his favor. Louise Hay's teaching centered on self-awareness and the healing of inner wounds through self-love. And one of the most powerful acts of self-love is refusing to engage in relationships that require you to doubt your value to stay connected. If someone cannot meet you in clarity, if they choose silence when they should choose presence, then what they're offering is not intimacy, it's control. He may not say a single word, but the silence says everything. I will not meet you emotionally. I will let you chase. I will let you overthink. I will let you work for the bare minimum. And you, conditioned by your own history, might call this love. But it's not. It's self-neglect disguised as devotion. It's control disguised as compatibility. It's a story written in silence, narrated by your insecurities, and edited by his refusal to speak. True love invites clarity. It welcomes expression. It doesn't punish vulnerability. And it never needs silence to survive. When a man ignores you, he's not being mysterious. He's maintaining control by denying access. And you, in your emotional depth, are left in the dark, trying to light the way with your own energy. But the more light you give, the more he steps into shadow. Not because you're too much, but because he cannot handle the weight of your truth. When a man ignores you, the surface impression might seem powerful, detached, stoic, untouchable. But underneath that quiet exterior, there is often something far more fragile. Silence is not strength. More often than not, it is insecurity wearing the mask of control. And understanding this doesn't just change how you view him. It changes how you understand your own role in the relationship. We've been conditioned to interpret emotional distance as mystery, as if a man who disappears is simply complex, deep, or not ready. But Louise Hay taught that our external relationships mirror our inner emotional states. So when a man withdraws into silence, he's not always creating boundaries. Sometimes, he's creating distance because being close would expose what he doesn't know how to handle. Not about you, but about himself. This is the core paradox. The more self-aware a woman is, the more intimidating she becomes to a man who hasn't done the same inner work. Your emotional depth challenges his emotional avoidance. Your clarity confronts his confusion. Your openness feels threatening to someone who was taught to equate vulnerability with weakness. So, he retreats, not because you are too much, but because he feels too little. And that's where the silence begins. But it's not a peaceful silence. It's a silence full of noise, full of anxiety, full of projections. And you feel it, not just as absence, but as rejection. You begin to question your worth. You wonder what you did wrong. And in doing so, you give his insecurity more power than it ever deserved. A secure man does not need to disappear to feel powerful. He does not need to ignore your messages to feel valuable. He does not create emotional distance to maintain his sense of control. When a man is secure within himself, he communicates, even if it's uncomfortable. He leans in, even when he feels uncertain. He holds space, Not because he has all the answers, but because he's not afraid of the questions. Insecurity, on the other hand, avoids mirrors. And that's exactly what you become in a relationship when you show up fully. A mirror, a reflection of everything he's not yet ready to face. That's why some men ignore you not out of strength, but out of fear. Because your presence reveals their emotional immaturity, their unresolved wounds, their internal chaos. But here's where the real danger lies. If you don't understand this dynamic, you will continue to believe that his silence is your fault. You'll try harder. You'll silence your own voice so his silence doesn't feel so loud. You'll make excuses for him, justifying the unjustifiable, with phrases like, he's just not good at expressing himself, or he's been through a lot. And slowly, you will internalize the idea that love requires suffering. That's what insecurity feeds on. Your confusion, your doubt, your willingness to carry emotional weight that was never yours to bear. Louise Hay would call this a deep wound of self-worth. It's the belief that love must be earned, that connection requires sacrifice, that being ignored is something you deserve. And until you heal that wound, you will mistake emotional unavailability for intensity. You will confuse pain with passion, and you will remain trapped in relationships that reflect not your truth, but your trauma. So how do you break the pattern? You stop interpreting silence as strength. You stop romanticizing emotional avoidance. You stop allowing your empathy to become a tool of self-betrayal. Because the truth is this: a man who ignores you is not strong. He is afraid of intimacy, afraid of emotional responsibility, afraid of not being enough. And rather than confront those fears, he chooses silence, not because he doesn't feel something for you, but because he doesn't know what to do with what he feels. And instead of owning that confusion, he lets you carry it. But that is not love. That is emotional outsourcing. And you are not here to carry what someone else refuses to hold. You deserve presence, not puzzles. You deserve clarity, not confusion. You deserve someone who doesn't hide behind silence, but stands beside you in truth, not perfectly, but honestly, not flawlessly, but openly. Silence, when used as a shield, isn't peaceful. It's violent, not in a loud way, but in a way that slowly erodes your self-worth. Because silence doesn't just leave you without answers, it leaves you with questions that turn into self-blame. And that is where your power begins, in recognizing that his silence is not your mirror. It is his mask, and your job is not to decode it. Your job is to stop mistaking it for something it's not. A real man doesn't hide behind silence. He meets you in it. When a man begins to withdraw, it may seem like he's pulling away from you. But in truth, what you're witnessing is not a rejection of you. It's a reflection of the inner conflict he's unable to resolve. Louise Hay emphasized that every relationship in our lives is a mirror. If someone disappears, detaches, or acts cold, it's not always because of what you said or did. Often it's because they are facing an emotional storm within that they never learned to calm. The man who ignores you is not in control. He is not above you. He is not powerful. He is, most likely, deeply lost inside his own unresolved pain. And the act of distancing himself from you is his way of avoiding the battlefield of his own emotions. He sees your presence, your strength, your clarity, and instead of being able to meet it with the same emotional maturity, he flinches, not outwardly but inwardly, because you touch a wound he never healed. Many of these wounds begin long before you ever appeared in his life. A childhood where vulnerability was punished. A past relationship where love meant control or manipulation. A culture that told him to be a man is to feel nothing. To cry is to be weak. To stay silent is to stay powerful. So, when real connection arrives, when you show up with depth, honesty, affection, his mind doesn't register it as safety. It registers it as danger. You become a trigger. And so he runs. But here's the twist. He's not running from you. He's running from the version of himself that he's never confronted. The part that longs for love but doesn't believe he deserves it. The part that wants connection but was taught to fear it. The part that craves intimacy but doesn't know how to hold it without feeling like he's losing control. This is the inner war. It's not just fear. It's shame. Shame of not being enough. Shame of not knowing how to love. Shame of needing someone. Because in his mind, needing is weakness. And rather than face these feelings head on, he buries them. He covers them with distraction, with silence, with detachment. Because if he speaks, he might reveal too much. If he stays, he might feel too much. And so he disappears, not because he doesn't care, but because he cares and doesn't know what to do with that. But here's the part no one tells you. It's not your job to be his peace treaty. You cannot negotiate with someone else's inner chaos. You cannot love someone into emotional maturity. You cannot hold space for a man who refuses to step into his own healing. And most importantly, you cannot make yourself small enough to fit into the silence he's created. Many women try. They soften their voice. They silence their needs. They wait, hoping he'll come back different. They internalize his avoidance as a sign they were too much. But all that does is prolong the pattern, because what he's truly avoiding is not your voice. It's his own. The man who ignores you is fighting a battle that began long before you. And the more you try to save him, the more you end up wounding yourself. Louise Hay would remind you, you cannot heal others by abandoning yourself. You cannot bring someone out of darkness by dimming your light. If a man is not ready to meet you where you are, it's not your responsibility to climb down to meet him in his confusion. And yet, it's easy to forget this when you care, when you feel the connection, when you've invested your heart. But love without self-respect becomes a form of self-betrayal. And the longer you stay in that space, waiting, justifying, hoping, the more you start to erode your own emotional truth. Let's be clear. There is no shame in wanting someone to choose you, but there is pain in choosing someone who has already chosen their fear over your presence. You deserve to be loved by someone who is not at war with himself every time you get close. You deserve a man who doesn't flinch when you love him fully. You deserve a connection where your voice is not too loud, your feelings are not too much, and your presence is not a threat. The truth is, many men will walk away not because you are wrong for them, but because they are not right within themselves. And you will feel the weight of that absence deeply, not because you lack anything, but because they couldn't carry the depth you offered. This isn't weakness. This isn't rejection. This is reflection. Reflection of the fact that you're evolving beyond dynamics that once made you question your worth. Reflection of the truth that you don't need to prove your value through silence, sacrifice, or suffering. The man who ignores you isn't rejecting you. He's revealing where he is on his own journey. And your healing begins the moment you stop personalizing his war. There comes a moment in every emotionally charged relationship where silence takes over the conversation. It's not just the absence of words, but the loud presence of everything unspoken. You reach out, and nothing comes back. You wait, but there's no response. You begin to wonder what you did wrong, what changed, why the connection that once felt so alive now echoes with distance. But here's the truth. His silence is not a puzzle for you to solve. It is not a riddle you must decode. His silence is his language. It speaks of his own discomfort, his own uncertainty, his own avoidance. And the mistake most women make is to fill that silence with self-blame. When a man grows distant, many women instinctively begin to analyze every detail of their last conversation. They question their tone, their timing, their truth. They soften their needs. They retract their vulnerability. They shrink themselves into what they think he can handle. But in doing that, they abandon the most important voice of all, their own. Silence from someone you care about triggers a survival instinct rooted deep in emotional trauma, especially for those who have grown up in environments where love was unstable, conditional, or absent. The quiet of another person can feel like a threat to your safety. It makes you feel like love is being taken away again, like you're not worthy of a consistent presence. But Louise Hay taught something profoundly simple. The way someone treats you is a reflection of their inner world. not of your worth. His silence might be his fear. It might be his immaturity. It might be his inability to express emotion or face discomfort. But none of that is a reason for you to abandon your own voice. None of that gives you a responsibility to compensate for the emotional gap he refuses to close. When he becomes quiet, listen to the parts of you that want to speak. Listen to the ache that says, I need to be seen. Listen to the wisdom that says, I deserve clarity. Listen to the truth that says, I am worthy of reciprocity. Because your emotional world matters. Your feelings, your questions, your needs. They are not too much. They are not dramatic. They are not wrong. What's wrong is believing that silence is the price you must pay for love. What's wrong is believing that being ignored is a sign that you need to do better. Too many women confuse emotional unavailability with emotional mystery. They romanticize the silence. They believe that the cold distance is somehow a sign of deep feeling, when in reality it's just a reflection of a man who doesn't yet know how to hold emotional space. And you don't have to make excuses for that. You don't have to translate his silence into your suffering. Because every time you choose to ignore your truth in order to wait for his, you lose a piece of your power. You silence the part of you that knows what real love feels like. And that silence, your silence, starts to shape your identity. You begin to see yourself through the lens of his distance. You begin to believe that love requires patience at the cost of self-worth. But it doesn't. It never did. Louise Hay reminded us that self-love is not just affirmations and rituals. It is boundaries. It is choosing yourself in moments when you've been taught to choose someone else. It is recognizing when your heart is whispering, you deserve more than this. And listening, even when it hurts. Because real love doesn't hide in silence. Real love speaks. Even when it's hard, real love shows up. It doesn't leave you wondering. It doesn't punish you with absence. It doesn't make you question your value. And the more you stay silent in response to his silence, the more you normalize emotional neglect as part of love. But love is not absence. Love is presence. And the only way to invite true presence into your life is to become radically present with yourself. To hear your own voice louder than the voice of his inconsistency. To honor your own truth more than you fear his withdrawal. To speak your heart, even if his is closed. This is not about confrontation. It's about connection to yourself. Because when you stop chasing answers in his silence, you begin to hear something far more powerful. The part of you that's been waiting for your own attention. You don't need him to explain his silence in order for you to find peace. You need only to stop using his absence as a mirror of your worth. His silence says more about him than it ever will about you. And when you choose to listen to yourself instead, you begin the most important conversation of all, the one that leads you home. There's a common misconception that runs deep in many romantic dynamics, especially when a man grows emotionally distant, that his withdrawal is mysterious, that his silence hides some hidden depth, that the space he creates is filled with meaning, that his coldness is somehow a sign of an emotional battle too deep to explain. But more often than not, that's not true. What we call mystery is frequently just avoidance in disguise. We live in a culture that romanticizes emotional unavailability. A man who doesn't express feelings is labeled as complex. A man who disappears and reappears without warning is seen as someone with inner turmoil. His inconsistency becomes seductive, as if we need to solve a riddle to finally be loved by him. But the truth is simpler and more painful. Emotional distance is often a defense mechanism, and when we mistake that for depth, we lose sight of ourselves. Many women carry a wound from childhood that tells them they must earn love. That affection is something to be won through patience, understanding, or sacrifice. So when they meet someone who pulls away emotionally, instead of recognizing the lack of availability, they feel challenged. It activates a desire to prove themselves, to stay, to wait, to dig deeper, to understand him. But Louise Hay reminded us of something different. The way others show up in our lives is a mirror of what we believe we deserve. If you believe you must work hard for love, you'll accept Emotional distance as a test. If you believe you're not fully worthy as you are, you'll tolerate silence, hoping your devotion will melt his walls. Here's what emotional avoidance really looks like. He doesn't talk when things get vulnerable. He becomes passive when you're hurt. He disappears when connection deepens. He jokes when you're serious. He invalidates your emotions when you're trying to open your heart. And you tell yourself he's just not good with emotions, or needs time, or had a difficult past. But no past justifies making you feel small in your present. What's even more dangerous is that this dynamic creates a toxic dance. The more he withdraws, the more you reach. The more you reach, the more he pulls back. And in that cycle, your sense of self starts to erode. You begin to feel that love is about proving, waiting, adapting, that his attention is a reward you have to earn. But love isn't supposed to feel like a prize. It's not a performance. It's not a project. It's a presence. When you confuse avoidance with mystery, you betray your own intuition, that voice inside you that knows when something doesn't feel right, that knows when your needs are being unmet, that knows when you're shrinking just to make someone else feel comfortable. And once you betray that voice long enough, it becomes harder to recognize what you truly want from love. Louise Hay taught that healing begins with self-honesty. And honesty means admitting that emotional distance hurts, that it doesn't make you feel safe, that it triggers abandonment wounds you've tried to bury, that it makes you feel invisible even when you're standing right in front of the person. And when you admit that, something shifts. You stop idealizing the emotionally distant man. You stop making excuses for his inability to show up. You start choosing you. A man who avoids emotions is not deep. He is disconnected. A man who runs from vulnerability is not mysterious. He is scared. A man who cannot hold space for your feelings is not protective. He is unavailable. And you are not meant to be the bridge between him and his emotional maturity. That is his work. Your work is to stay connected to your truth, to stop turning coldness into romance, to stop turning withdrawal into longing, to stop calling silence intimacy. Because the more you label his avoidance as something poetic, the more you distance yourself from the love you truly deserve. Real love is not a guessing game. It doesn't leave you wondering where you stand. It doesn't ask you to chase clarity. It doesn't ask you to carry the emotional labor of both people. It meets you. It sees you. It stays. And it feels safe. So when emotional distance appears, again, whether in words left unsaid, messages unanswered, or presence withheld, don't fill the silence with fantasy. Don't write a love story where there is none. Instead, listen to what the distance is really telling you. Not about him, but about you, about what you long for, about what you will no longer accept, about how far you've come from the version of you that used to settle for almost love. Because once you stop mistaking avoidance for mystery, you make space for something far more powerful. Love that doesn't hide. Love that doesn't run. Love that doesn't make you question yourself every day. And in that space, you begin to return to your center, the part of you that remembers what it feels like to be chosen, not chased. When a man ignores you, the first instinct is to believe he holds all the power. His silence feels like a position of control. The distance he creates makes you question your value, your presence, your worth. And in that imbalance, you might assume he is the one who is emotionally stronger, unaffected, detached, above it all. But that's not the truth. What looks like power on the surface is often just paralysis underneath. Indifference is not strength. Indifference is fear with a mask on. Louise Hay often spoke about how the behaviors of others are projections of their own internal battles. A man who acts indifferent is not immune to feeling. He is overwhelmed by it. He is not emotionally evolved. He is emotionally frozen. And what appears to be calculated distance is often the inability to face his own emotional vulnerability. This kind of fear has deep roots. Some men were raised to believe that emotions are weaknesses, that to be masculine is to be invulnerable, that opening up is dangerous, that expressing love equals losing control. So instead of showing how they feel, they pull away. Instead of leaning into connection, They put up walls, and when they do feel something real, they shut down because they were never taught how to hold that kind of emotional weight. The tragedy is that many women internalize this behavior as rejection. When he ignores, they feel unloved. When he distances himself, they feel abandoned. But the truth is, the distance is not a rejection of you. It's a rejection of his own feelings. You became a mirror, and he couldn't handle what he saw. That's the hidden weakness, the inability to be present with one's own emotional truth. A man who cannot confront his feelings will always run when the connection gets deep. He will mask his fear with logic, timing, excuses. He will say, "I'm not ready. You deserve more. It's not the right time." But behind every excuse is the same wound, the terror of being seen. What's dangerous about this dynamic is that many women try to fix it. They sense his discomfort and try to make him feel safe. They become emotionally available for both. They hold the space. They wait. They stay patient, hoping he'll eventually come around. But what they're really doing is abandoning themselves in the name of love. You can't love someone enough to make them emotionally available. You can't speak gently enough to make them hear you. You can't prove your worth enough to make them ready. Because his indifference isn't about what you lack. It's about what he's afraid to feel. The real power doesn't lie with the one who avoids connection. The real power lies with the one who can stay emotionally present, with the one who can say, "This hurts me," without collapsing, with the one who can love without turning that love into self-erasure, with the one who refuses to turn someone else's emotional immaturity into a life project. Louise. Hay would remind us that healing doesn't come from convincing others to love us. It comes from recognizing the places where we have stopped loving ourselves. If you keep attracting men who grow distant the moment things get real, it's not a sign that you're too much. It's a sign that you're offering intimacy to people who haven't offered it to themselves. Indifference is a form of self-protection, but you are not responsible for protecting someone from their own evolution. You are not responsible for walking on eggshells to keep someone else from breaking open. If he is paralyzed by his feelings, the work belongs to him, and no amount of patience or perfection on your part can substitute the inner work he refuses to do. What matters most is that you no longer shrink in the presence of emotional cowardice, that you no longer see his silence as mystery or strength, that you stop measuring your worth against someone's inability to receive it. A man who truly wants to love will show up. He will speak. He will be there. He will feel, even if it's messy, even if it's hard, because love requires courage. And if someone lacks the courage to be present with their own heart, they will never be able to hold yours. And that realization, that shift from chasing love to standing in your own truth is what begins to undo the pattern. It's where the healing starts. Not by fixing him, but by seeing clearly. The greatest weakness of a man who ignores you is not that he doesn't care. It's that he doesn't know how to feel. And love cannot grow where fear is stronger than the desire to stay. From that point on, something changes in you. You stop being the one who waits. You stop seeing his absence as a puzzle. You stop trying to decode the silence. You start listening to yourself instead. And in that shift, you become the one who is no longer afraid of feeling. You become the one who stays, not for someone else, but for yourself. When a man ignores you, it's tempting to fill the silence with fantasies of strength or mystery. Maybe he's thinking deeply. Maybe he's reflecting. Maybe he's just busy or focused on himself. But more often than not, what hides beneath that silence is not wisdom or composure. It's emotional immaturity. A man doesn't withdraw from someone he cares about because he's strong. He does it because he doesn't know what to do with the emotions that presence brings. There is a kind of emotional unpreparedness that many men carry, not because they are incapable of love, but because they never learned how to hold it. They didn't grow up in spaces where emotions were welcomed. They were taught to be stoic, to fix, to perform, to succeed. But they were never taught to sit with discomfort, to hold space for a feeling without shutting down, to be vulnerable without seeing it as a threat. So when they encounter a woman who is emotionally present, who brings real intimacy to the table, they don't know how to meet her. They freeze, they disconnect, they ghost, delay, distract. Because being emotionally met requires maturity. It requires inner work. It demands that a man knows how to stay with himself, even when things get uncomfortable. And yet, so many women internalize this immaturity as failure on their part. They blame themselves for being too intense, too sensitive, too loving, too complicated. They believe that if they were just a little bit easier, less emotional, less expressive, maybe he would stay. But this is not a reflection of their flaw. It's a reflection of his unreadiness. Emotional immaturity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "I'm not ready to love you the way you deserve." It says, "I'm busy. You're too intense. This isn't working. I need time." Or, worst of all, it says nothing. It disappears. And in that disappearing act, it avoids responsibility. It leaves the woman to process what he couldn't. It leaves her holding the emotional weight of two people. Louise Hay often emphasized that we teach others how to treat us by the boundaries we maintain. When we accept inconsistency, silence, and emotional distance as part of a relationship, we are telling ourselves that we're okay with being emotionally starved. But love isn't built in absence. It is built in presence, in consistency, in the small daily choices to show up. A man who ignores you is not making a subtle statement about you. He's revealing the limits of his emotional capacity. You don't need to decode his silence or interpret his withdrawal. His actions already speak loudly. And if he is not able to meet you emotionally, no amount of guessing, waiting, or fixing will make him mature overnight. Many women try to parent this kind of man emotionally. They coach, they encourage, they soften themselves, they shrink their needs. But what ends up happening is that they become mothers instead of partners. And no romantic relationship survives when the dynamic is built on imbalance, when one gives and the other avoids, when one speaks and the other hides. Real connection doesn't grow in silence. It grows in communication, in the uncomfortable truth, in the willingness to be seen even when you're unsure. A mature man doesn't hide behind silence. He learns how to use his voice, even when it shakes. He learns how to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. He learns that love isn't always about being ready. It's about being willing. And that's where the shift begins. Not in waiting for him to change, but in recognizing what his silence truly means. It means he's not ready for the depth you carry. It means he hasn't done the work. It means he's still using avoidance as a coping mechanism instead of showing up as a grown man. Emotional immaturity is not a crime, but it is a responsibility. And when someone continues to hurt others with their avoidance, that's no longer a limitation. It becomes a choice to remain unaware, a choice to continue relationships where they can avoid emotional labor, a choice to let others carry the weight they refuse to hold. As a woman, your healing begins the moment you stop romanticizing this behavior, the moment you stop calling silence strength, the moment you stop trying to rescue a man from the very journey he needs to walk alone. Because that journey, the journey of emotional maturity, is not something you can hand to someone. It's something they have to choose for themselves. And when they don't, you choosing yourself becomes the loudest message, not as a punishment, but as a truth, a declaration that you are no longer available for relationships where silence replaces intimacy, where guessing replaces clarity, where emotional avoidance is mistaken for control. You are not too much. You are not too deep. You are not too complex. You are simply no longer willing to shrink for someone who is not willing to grow. There is a silent battle that happens inside some men when they meet a woman who has done her inner work. A woman who no longer begs for love, who has stopped making herself small, who no longer trades her self-worth for temporary affection. She doesn't play games. She doesn't chase. She doesn't pretend to be less intelligent, less sensitive, less intense, just to keep someone's attention. Instead, she stays rooted. She has boundaries. She knows what she brings. And while that kind of woman is deeply magnetic, she can also be deeply confronting. especially to a man who hasn't yet faced his own fears. He may feel drawn to her confidence, to her calm, to her emotional clarity, but as the connection deepens, something in him starts to resist, not because she is wrong for him, but because she shows him everything he hasn't yet become. She reflects back to him his own insecurities. She activates the places in him where he still feels unworthy, unsure, unprepared. And instead of rising to meet her, he starts to pull away. This is the paradox. He wants her, but he doesn't know how to handle the version of himself that shows up in her presence. Not because she's demanding, not because she's cold or difficult, but because she requires truth, and truth is something many men weren't taught how to hold. They were taught how to impress, how to win, how to dominate, but they weren't taught how to sit with their emotional mess and still stay present. So when a woman shows up fully, not needing to be fixed or saved or validated, it disarms him, not because she's too much, but because she asks for the one thing he's never given to himself: wholeness, emotional maturity, self-responsibility. And here's the part many women miss. When a man walks away from a strong woman, it's not a statement about her value. It's a reflection of his discomfort with himself. He doesn't want a strong woman because he hasn't yet become a strong man. Not in the way that matters. Not in his ability to be vulnerable, to hold space, to sit in silence without turning it into avoidance, to love without losing himself. A strong woman triggers a weak foundation, not because she's unkind, but because she's stable. And you can't build something real with someone who is still avoiding the weight of their own emotional truth. He'll see her as too independent, too self-aware, too clear. But those are not flaws. Those are strengths. He just hasn't learned how to meet them without shrinking. Many women try to downplay themselves in these moments. They dim their light. They soften their needs. They make themselves more palatable, hoping it will make him stay. But it doesn't. It just delays the inevitable. Because the problem was never her strength. It was his unreadiness. Louise. Hay often reminded us that relationships are mirrors. And when someone turns away from your truth, it's not your job to chase them. It's your job to hold that truth even tighter. To remember that love doesn't grow in self-abandonment. It grows in self-honoring. When a man can't stand next to a strong woman, it's because he hasn't yet made peace with his own shadows. He hasn't yet stepped into his own emotional power. And until he does, he will keep misinterpreting confidence as arrogance, boundaries as rejection, emotional depth as danger. So what do you do when this happens? You let him go. You don't shrink. You don't explain. You don't prove your worth to someone who couldn't even recognize his own. Because the man who is ready, truly ready, will not run from your strength. He will recognize it. He will respect it. And more than that, he will match it. Not by being perfect, but by being present, by being real, by showing up with his own scars and saying, "I'm here anyway." That is the kind of love that doesn't require chasing. That is the kind of love that doesn't get scared of your fire. It learns how to hold it, not because it wants to tame you, but because it's done hiding from its own. And in the end, it's not about finding someone who makes you feel small enough to be loved. It's about standing in your full power and knowing that the right love will never ask you to leave any part of yourself behind. Not your strength, not your softness, not your story. Because the man who's truly ready for you doesn't fear your truth. He's been searching for it too. There comes a moment in the journey of every woman when exhaustion becomes louder than desire. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from doing too much, but the deeper kind. The one that builds up after years of chasing love that only runs, of giving more than she receives, of constantly bending to be seen, chosen, or understood. It's a soul-level fatigue. And eventually, something inside her breaks. Not in defeat, but in clarity. She no longer wants to prove her worth to anyone. She no longer needs to be wanted by someone who doesn't know how to hold what she brings. She stops trying to be less, stops performing for love, stops rearranging her truth to make it easier to swallow. And when that happens, when she stops chasing, something radical begins to shift. She becomes magnetic, not because she's louder, not because she's suddenly more appealing to the eyes of others, but because her energy changes. The desperation disappears. The fear dissolves. The endless search for external validation comes to a halt. And in that stillness, in that space of self-return, she starts to attract from a place of alignment, not lack. This is something Louise Hay spoke about often. The moment we begin to love ourselves as we are, without needing others to complete us, the entire vibration of our life begins to change. When you stop chasing, it's not about giving up. It's about remembering. Remembering that you were never supposed to beg to be loved. That you were never meant to prove you are enough. That you don't need to manipulate your presence to be chosen. Real love doesn't need to be hunted down. It recognizes you. And not just for your beauty, or your kindness, or your emotional depth, but for your truth, your essence, your wholeness. The chase, though romanticized in movies and culture, is a symptom of inner disconnection. We chase what we think we need. But once we meet those needs within, the chase loses its grip. The man who is truly meant for you doesn't show up because you chased him down. He doesn't come into your life because you molded yourself into what he wanted. He comes because your energy aligned with his readiness, because your self-honoring became a mirror for his own growth, because instead of running after love, you created space for love to arrive. And here's the deeper truth. Sometimes, what's meant for you can't reach you until you stop trying to force what isn't. So many women block aligned love because their energy is still tied to proving, fixing, convincing, to relationships that only offered crumbs, to men who only offered confusion, to dynamics rooted in fear. When you stop chasing, you say no to all of that. You declare, not with words but with your presence, that you are no longer available for love that costs you your peace, that you are no longer willing to abandon yourself just to feel momentarily desired. You return home to yourself, and from that place, love finds you. Not always immediately, not always in the form you expect, but it comes, because now there's space for it to land. This shift doesn't mean you close your heart. It means you stop handing it over to anyone who isn't equipped to hold it. It means you become discerning, intentional. You still feel deeply. You still believe in connection. But now, you know what you deserve, and you're willing to wait. To be alone, if necessary. Not from bitterness, but from wisdom. Because you've learned that your value is not determined by who stays or who leaves. It's not measured by how quickly someone replies or how often they reach out. It's measured by how deeply you choose to honor yourself, even when no one is watching. That is where true power lives. And when the right man appears, not the one who wants to conquer you, or possess you, or tame you, but the one who sees you, respects you, walks beside you, without trying to dim your light, you'll know. Because you didn't chase him. You didn't perform for him. You met him from your fullness, not your fear. Louise Hay taught that everything begins within. That when you heal your relationship with yourself, every other relationship in your life transforms. And in the end, that is what allows love to flourish. Not the chase, not the performance, but the presence. When you stop chasing, you don't lose love. You become the invitation for the kind of love that was waiting for you all along. The love that doesn't ask you to run after it, because it already knows where home is, and this time, it looks like you.